All right, so as we pick back up in 13 of Exodus, I promised you guys that I would push the pause button for a few moments and just ask after, because I challenge you guys to reread 12 and 13 and just come with any questions that you may still have regarding not only the Exodus, the way the people left, but how these feasts, the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and also the consecration of the firstborn, how it relates with the 10th plague. So I just wanted to pause for just a moment, not a moment, but even if we have to take the rest of the time to kind of talk through any questions that you guys may have had. I did continue to prepare for 17 through the end of the chapter, but we don't have to get there today. I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page as we move forward through Exodus. So with that in mind, do we have any questions, any burning things that as you reread or you wanted to know more about or had some questions concerning? Okay.
So after after we said that some of the Egyptians did leave, right? And so
we assume some of them left.
Okay.
From the language that's being used there, and that the multitude that left. So a mixed multitude. This is verse 38 of chapter 12. A mixed multitude also went up with them. Speaking of the Israelites. And a very, very much livestock, both flocks and herds. From that, we can kind of deduce that it wasn't just the Israelites. And so we would assume that maybe some of the Egyptians, quite possibly, declared like, you know what, Yahweh is the one true God, and so we're going to follow after him.
So are they separated from the rest of the book when he's talking about my people, or are they included now? Did the Passover include those people?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Fantastic question as it relates to consecration of the firstborn and also to the institution of Passover. So as we pointed out last time, entrance into the people of God was a two-part thing. It was take on the covenant sign of circumcision, and it was practicing the Passover. So those two things seem to equate to membership in the people of God. And so I would probably say if those people did come out of Egypt with the Israelites, and they did seek to follow Yahweh, one of those things that they would have had to do was to be circumcised, them and their entire household, which is why I believe that the institution of Passover follows where it does in the story in verses 43 all the way to 51. Because it is giving instruction then for those who are not ethnic Israel, who are not connected to the fathers, so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It gives instruction on how are they to be included then. Are they to be included in the feasts of Passover now that they have kind of joined up with the Israelites? And so I think that kind of answers the question as to why this whole section seems maybe a little bit disjointed. It seems like he's jumping around to, well, here's the actual Passover, here's the instruction for this, and here's the instruction for this. Oh, let me go back and cover this, and then here's the institution for later for the same thing that I was talking about earlier, and then here's something else that connects to this. It seems as though the author is making intentional moves of placing things certain places in the narrative that makes sense to answer questions that the reader would have. And 43 of chapter 12 through 51 seems to be one of those places where it's just talked about them leaving Egypt proper and this mixed multitude going up with them. And then it answers the question of what about the sojourner? What about the person who is not a native Israelite, namely connected to the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? So does that make sense at all?
Yeah. So it just seems like, I guess when I started reading the Bible from the beginning, it was like the Old Testament was just more for what Israelites and his people, and this just kind of seems like it's been for Gentiles and everybody. It wasn't just for his people. It was just anybody who really believed from the beginning.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it is certainly a precursor of that truth, right? And I think that this inclusion here at 43 and following, at the very least, I don't know how anyone could get around lays the groundwork for Gentile or non-Israelite inclusion into God's people as they worship Him. I don't know how people could argue against the ability of people to join the people of God who are not native Israelites. But you are absolutely right in that most of the time when we think of the Old Testament, we think of, okay, this is a book that is strictly for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The graces that God is giving are only for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The land is only for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And while that is true, the land portion at least, it seems as though there is a means by which people are included in God's people that are in addition to being born in through their lineage. Does that make sense? Any pushback on that? Any thoughts?
I mean, just like individual like examples of like Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, like doesn't that kind of just serve to buttress that too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're
That's
absolutely
what I was
right.
thinking.
Absolutely right. So there are individual expressions of what would come to be known as Gentile inclusion, non-Israelite inclusion in God's people that we can point to. And those were three that he mentioned, he rattled off there, that are very good. I can't remember if you mentioned two or three. I think it's three.
It's three. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tamar, all women, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth.
Right.
Yeah.
So all three of those women are included in the people of God because of their decision to worship Yahweh in a very specific way and to take upon themselves, if you want to think of it like this, the yoke of God, the true God, and abdicate or put away their other gods that they once held to. It's a very strong language of inclusion. And again, this is why I argue that 43 through 51 of chapter 12 is monumental in the life of Israel for the future, because it gives a means by which people are entering or can enter into the people of God. You get this plus this equals my people, right? So circumcision plus Passover equals my people. So does that help kind of navigate any?
But now I got the other part of why is it only circumcision? Why is it only male? What about?
Yeah.
Seems unfair.
Yeah. So, well, unfair depending on how you look at things. As far as hurting, but no. By and large, it would be that it would be the head of household, which would be the male, that would be entering and making the primary decisions for the family unit. However, you do have, it's interesting, again, the three examples that are individualized are women. And there were cultures in the ancient Near East, this is just for your knowledge, that did practice female circumcision, which is a very unpleasant, awful thing. The Israelites were not. They did not do that. And so in that case, right, so then you'd have a female, say Ruth, for instance. Ruth would enter into the people of God by her decision to follow Yahweh. Her firstborn would then be followed in the consecration of the firstborn. Her firstborn male would then follow through. She would perform that rite. And by virtue of not only performing that rite, it's not that she has to wait to become a people of God, but by following that rite, she's showing herself to be a true Israelite or a true Yahweh follower. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So again, it's a kind of it's not that women are not part of the people of God and only men are. It's not just a he-man woman haters club. It's more like the description of who is the head of household, who is making the decisions for entrance into or moving to a new area or joining a particular people group, who would then be responsible for fighting for that people group, say in a battle that were to come up. that would by and large be the men of those people. Because again, in the ancient Near East, that happened all the time. Defense of your land happened all the time. And who was called up to do that? Well, it was the men, by and large. And so that's one of the reasons for that. And so circumcision, how it fits into the situation was these females that would then join up. They would have their firstborn male or their males circumcised. So Ruth is a very interesting case because she comes after the death of her husband, right, to the land by way of her mother-in-law. And in doing so, she is, again, uniting herself with the God of her mother-in-law, kind of remaining under, if you will, the headship of her husband. So, any further follow-up questions?
I think I'm good.
Okay. It's okay. Like, I mean, this is great. Like I said, this is why I wanted to pause for a minute, because we've gone over a tremendous amount of material in the 10th plague, with Passover, with consecration of firstborn, with unleavened bread. All of these things are just, they loom very large, is all I'm trying to say, in the Old Testament narrative from here on out. And so I want to make sure that we have a good grasp of them before we go forward, and before you continue to read the Old Testament, which I hope that you do, because not enough Christians do.
So, well, I do have another question.
Yep, go for it.
Back earlier in Exodus, I guess we assume that not any of the Israel slaves could just walk right in. Did Pharaoh and Moses have some kind of relationship since Moses grew up? Did he grow up in the temple?
In Pharaoh's house?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he did.
Was that lean? So did he like show some lean? Because I would have thought he would have probably killed him the first time he walked in there.
Yeah, so you're talking with before all the plagues started happening, right, and all that stuff. Yeah, so he could be just being treated as an emissary, essentially. And as he is now a representative, if you will, of the Israelite people, they had that structure already, as we kind of looked at and talked through in the first parts of Exodus, where you have these, you have kind of the slave hands, which were Egyptian, and then you had people under them that stair-stepped down, who were Israelites, but they were in charge of kind of more Israelites and what they did. So you had this structure already that, information flowed up and down this chain. But what we have with Moses is actually coming in from the outside and speaking for them by way of uniting with Aaron, which is why that union is so important, that Aaron and Moses come as a united front, because Aaron representing the people of God, namely the Israelites who had always been under slavery, and Moses being the voice from God as he returns from the wilderness. And so you have this kind of interplay with Aaron, who is seen as a leader in the midst of the Israelites, joining with Moses, who is returning, and then coming and presenting a case to the Pharaoh as to, this is what God has said about this people that you were enslaving, let them go. So does that help kind of navigate? It's not so much a special relationship that Moses and Pharaoh had, although that that is a possibility. That's what's depicted in pretty much every rendition of the Exodus, whether you're looking at Charlton Heston's 10 Commandments, or you're looking at Prince of Egypt, or you're whether looking at the more modern atrocious Gods of Egypt with Christian Bale. You have this kind of assumed connection or relationship that existed between the Pharaoh and between Moses. Is that possible? Certainly. They may have known each other. I mean, they possibly raised as brothers, if you could think of it that way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he would have just been like, oh yeah, welcome back. Because when he was kicked out, or when he was forced out of Egypt, it was because he had murdered an Egyptian. And Pharaoh was kind of upset about that. Like, it's not something that you just kind of forget. Like, you murdered somebody. Oh yeah, welcome back into my court. Come on in. Let us sit down and have a chat. That's not necessarily something that would have happened. So he set himself at odds with Pharaoh before he ever left, through killing the Egyptian. That's why when we were going through that section, I made such a strong, I tried to make such a strong point, our argument that in him doing that, he chose Israel in that moment. And his Hebrewness, if you will, if you want to label it that, he chose that. And at that point set himself at odds against Egypt. And so he wouldn't have just been like, welcome back, like, hey, what's up? Where you been for 40 years? Like, what's up? Oh, it's great to have you back. But no, it's probably not what would have happened in the court. So he comes back as an opposing force, if you joining with an existing force in Aaron. So it's very, very tense.
And it's just, I guess, the will of God is why Pharaoh didn't grab him and throw him right into the prison right then.
Well, I mean, he could have very well been fearful of revolt. I mean, think about it. You have, 500,000 male slaves underneath you, right? And you take one of their leaders, namely Aaron, who would have been there with Moses, because remember, Moses tells Aaron and Aaron tells Pharaoh, right? If he would have killed Moses, he'd have had to kill Aaron because they're there at the same time. And so, I mean, you're looking at possibility of revolt at that point. So at that point, Pharaoh just has to kind of listen and hear what they have to say. I would argue that's kind of the political realities of what's going on in Egypt there. Because if he would have killed Aaron and Moses at that point when they came to him the first time, there'd been nothing to prevent the Israelites from revolting against their slave masters and then up the chain. I would argue. Good questions. This is awesome. Any others?
I have kind of like a follow-up question to his earlier one of like, I feel like a lot of times people talk away the anti-feministness of the Old Testament by being like, well, it's biblical times, blah, 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 blah. And even you kind of did it there where you're like, well, they're the ones who would have been able to fight. Well, but this is God establishing his people.
Mm-hmm.
Like he literally is giving them the laws.
Mm-hmm.
And he's giving them laws that are all very anti-feminine.
Mm-hmm.
So God is not constrained by what time period he's giving people laws.
Mm-hmm.
How would you answer that?
Right. So I guess one way that I would answer the patriarchal reality of the Old Testament text, that's kind of the crux of the question there. And one thing that I would say is that the laws that are given, namely the moral laws that are given there, are not necessarily feminist or anti-feminist. So a lot of them are dealing with the holiness of who God is. And so while you have that, you do have some of this, some language in particular that is dealing with females. So laws of menstruation, all of those things, right? And it's not that I would talk them away per se. God is still writing or giving laws to a people in a particular time. And I don't know if we can say that any of the laws do harm per se to females. The ones that could possibly maybe have a discussion about would be some of the ones regarding the daughters, right? So having a daughter in promiscuity, what do you do about that? And how it is that a father is supposed to respond in the midst of that.
Well, even like in these very first times where he's talking about like, oh, when you have a firstborn male, do all of this, redeem it, blah, blah, blah. Well, if your firstborn's a daughter, skip her. Wait till you have a guy. Like, even like the thought process behind that of like, wait till there's a guy.
Right. And so the consecration of the firstborn, and that's why I was trying to make a very specific point last week, that it is tied directly to the 10th plague. It's not a male versus female type thing. It's the 10th plague revolved around the killing of the firstborn male son. And the reason that is because that was the family's progeny. That's the way that the family name continued. And so in that, the existence of the family unit continuing from that point forward would be predicated upon having a male.
Right, but what I'm saying, that's what I'm saying here is like God is establishing his people.
Mhm.
He could have changed that. He
Right.
could have been like, well, now do it through your daughters.
Right, and that's why I think it's so important that we relate the consecration of the firstborn to the 10th plague, because then we have that answer as to why is it connected to the male firstborn, is because that's what God required from the Egyptians. Your firstborn male will be dead.
So they're just redeeming the firstborn because of the plague.
Yes.
So what are they being redeemed from then?
So what they're being redeemed from is the reality that they deserve to die. Their firstborn male also. Israel is not somehow disconnected in the realm of sinfulness and difficulty with sin. So their firstborn male, the only reason that their firstborn male was not killed was because they spread the blood on the doorpost of the house. Had they not done that, the destroyer would have killed their firstborn male. And so the redemption of the firstborn male becomes this kind of motif, this portrait of the way that God redeemed his firstborn in Israel. Because Israel is described, particularly in chapter 4, verse 22, as God's firstborn son. And so as Israel is described there, he's going to require that of the people who are showing opposition to him, namely the Egyptians. And then at the Exodus, their firstborn son, if you think of it like their firstborn son is saved in a sense by the Passover lamb that is slain. And thereby the larger motif there is God's firstborn son, Israel, continues to exist because of their obedience to sacrifice the lamb. And so it becomes less about maleship or maleness and femaleness, and more about who is God's. And the firstborn becomes the firstborn male in particular becomes kind of the portrait through which the ownership of God is portrayed. And the same thing again happens when we get to Jesus. And the fact is that it's not, the reason why I would say that it's not necessarily maleness and femaleness is because the second son, he didn't get this either. The third son, fourth son, whatever. It's only the firstborn particular male, which is why I tie it directly to the 10th plague, because it's the only way, that's the only link, it seems, that makes sense. Because why not? Why wouldn't you consecrate your second-born son if it's about males? If it's only about males and not about females, why not consecrate your first, second, third, however many sons that you have? And so it seems as though the text is making a very stringent connection to the 10th plague and what they just came out of, and trying to create a memorial around the fact that their firstborn son would have been required of them had it not been for God's grace and their obedience to sacrifice a lamb to save them. And so redemption of the firstborn happened in a couple of different ways: the giving of the lamb or the giving of the child into service to the Lord, like we see with Hannah and Samuel. And so I also don't want to downplay what what can be what can be a difficulty in the text at times when we talk through why didn't God just flip the script? I guess the question that I would ask of myself is, okay, what would I have had God do? How would he have, or should he have done what he was desiring to do? Is the question that I would ask myself and frankly have when it comes to this idea of quote unquote the patriarchy as it has been deemed in modern feminism. But how would I have expected or required God to do something different, working again within the culture in which he is set? Because you still, I mean, stacking up the law of God against other law codes in the ancient Near East, I mean, it is leagues above its treatment of women as it relates to other cultures during the same time period. And I don't, and it's not, again, I'm not trying to just explain it away. It's just that I don't know what God could have or should have done differently in looking back into it, particularly with the point that it seems as though he's trying to make, in that, no, you in your entirety and your future are mine, which is what you're saying when you say, here, Lord, here is my firstborn son. All of the hope that I have in the progeny of my name, the continuation of my name, is given over to you. And so I don't know exactly how else I would expect God to have handled what he was trying to do. And I don't know if that helps at all, but any follow-up or pushback, like seriously, like, this is a good conversation to have.
I think for me, then it's the question of, okay, so we're just remembering the 10th plague. But he's requiring a sacrifice to be redeemed from something. Namely, the fact that they now deserve death. But that means that logically following that, then God is just saying, hey, if you're a firstborn male, you deserve to die.
Well, in the same way that his firstborn son in Israel deserved to die. That's the motif that's being carried on through.
Right, but there's the difference between like, this is motif, blah, 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 but he's requiring physical death. He's requiring a sacrifice for this. That's not just like symbolism there. That's being, hey, if you don't give me an animal, I'm going to require his death. That's
or require his service.
Right, but that's a big step up from just, we're going to remember the 10th plague.
Well, I mean, it depends on how you look at remembering the 10th plague. I mean, remembering the 10th plague is essentially memorializing what gave rise to the Exodus and their continuation as a people. And so not facing death themselves, either at the hand of Egypt or at the hand of God. And so when they're remembering the 10th plague by way of giving over to the Lord that which would have been taken from them because of their sinfulness, God is in a sense saying, you are mine, and this is what is required for redemption to take place. Because the wrath of God came down upon Egypt, right, and would have come down upon Israel had it not been for their sacrifice of the lamb. And again, I mean, yeah, you're dealing with realities. Had an Israelite just said, "No, I'm not going to do the Passover," their firstborn would have
I
died.
guess my question then is, what if they don't contribute the firstborn? What happens?
Gotcha. Okay. So they would be essentially. I'm trying to remember exactly where it is in the
Like,
text.
what happens to the firstborn, not the person who doesn't contribute?
Right. They would essentially be in opposition to the law, and so
The firstborn.
the family.
The 10 daily tribe.
No, the family. I would argue.
Right, but then
So they would be breaking the law of God or doing that. It's the same type of thing with what happens if they didn't circumcise the child on the 8th day. Well, there were subsequent days in which they could, right? They didn't follow the law perfectly, but they ended up following the law later.
What happens to the child?
They would continue to be in the care of their parents. They wouldn't be like stolen away.
I think it's like the fact that you're using the language of they're redeeming the firstborn.
Mhm.
What are they redeeming the firstborn from?
From again, I think that what is going on here is the memorialization of what it took for them to be redeemed, for them to be
So
let
the
out.
firstborn's not actually being redeemed. It's just all of the.
Well, I mean, the firstborn would suffer the same fate of their parents, which transgression of the transgression of the law would be you're cut off from the people.
Well, we have a 3-month-old is now in transgression of the law just because he happened to be the firstborn.
Well, because he's part of the family that chose not to do that, then yeah. And so the people, the family unit would be that which would be cut off from the people of God.
So he doesn't have a chance himself to redeem himself? I mean,
Yeah, but when you say cast, is that cast out like Cain? What, he was cast out, right?
Well, so when I say cut off from the people,
He would be cut off, but Cain was.
well, Cain's a whole nother animal
Okay.
that I don't know if I want to go into right now.
They would be kicked out of Israel.
Yeah, they would be.
Community.
Right. But mine have like, you just said the 3-year-old, like the 3-month-old, because he wasn't redeemed by the Lord, is now in transgression of the law. Then he's just a 3-month-old. And we're gonna hold him to that?
Well, I mean, well,
because they're looking at him as a family.
I mean, not only that, the reality is that we all at birth are in transgression of the law. So it doesn't.
Right, but like, for me, like, the idea is like, this 3-month-old now has an extra transgression of the law just because he happened to be the firstborn male. How's that right?
Well, I mean, it'd be the sin of the sin of the parents to not follow through with the law that has been given to them. And so therefore the entire family unit, not just the 3-month-old, the entire family unit would then be cut out of the inheritance of God and cast away
If they
from.
follow the kid's own, he's still recommended for it.
Right.
No, that's not fair.
But could that kid come back later and repent and make up for what his family did to him?
I mean, I guess he, presumably, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about particularly the firstborn consecration, what they are requiring of the family in the consecration of this firstborn is not, I'm trying to find it's not rocket science, and it's not an absorbently high price
Right,
for you to
but
follow
to
the law
me-
of the Lord.
To me, it's not the idea of like, oh, they have to do this big, huge thing, and like, they didn't, but like, you know, 'cause it's like, I don't know, but like, it'd be like, okay, if it was like a baptism, it's like, come baptize a kid on the 8th day, or you're within transgression of the law, okay. But then when you don't, somehow the kid has a transgression.
Well, I mean, So I don't.
Like the fact that the kid, just because he's the firstborn, has this opportunity to have an extra life. Like, why is somebody the firstborn? My thoughts will come together.
No. I mean, no. It's a good question to kind of wrestle through. And so at this point, I think it would be helpful to kind of reread part of the passage here in Exodus 13. So we'll read verses 1 and 2, and then we'll read 11 through 5 and following. So first, the Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever is first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both man and beast is mine." When the Lord, this is skipping over to verse 11, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstborn of a donkey shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your son asks you, "What does this mean?" you shall say to him, "By a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a mark on your hand, your frontlets between your eyes, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of the land of Egypt." And so the question as to what would happen if they didn't do this would be, yes, they would be guilty, predominantly the parents, be guilty of not following the law of the Lord, in remembering and commemorating, if you will, what it took for their own redemption to happen. And that is a very serious offense for the family. Now, because the family makes that decision, right, the repercussions, which the text here does not give us what the repercussions of not doing this would be. We're only assuming in a certain set of things that they would be excommunicated from the people of God. I think that would be a fair assumption on a number of occasions because of the failure to adhere to other feasts is similarly. So fail to eat of the Passover or fail to partake of the Passover, that's the judgment, right? Kicking out of the people of God. There are a couple of our feasts that, if not followed correctly, it could come to that. Now, that's an entire family reality that would happen. So the question as to what is the fault of the firstborn per se, it has nothing to do really with the fault of the firstborn. It's that his parents are now kicked out of the people of God. Now, presumably, I mean, again, all of this is somewhat assumption. If for whatever reason they wanted to do this and not follow through with the consecration of their firstborn, they would then be ushered out of the land which God had promised to his people, because this is something that his people have now upon them to do, because God has said, "I redeemed you. This is now what I require of you, the following of my law." The question as to what it is that, like the extra transgression that is being laid upon the firstborn, I don't necessarily see it. I guess I'm misunderstanding. I don't see an extra transgression that is laid upon the son here. I see parents who are unwilling to do that which God has instructed them to do, and therefore the consequences of their actions have repercussions upon them and their families, unless they want to leave the 3-month-olds there in Israel, which, again, because of the valuableness, if you will, of a firstborn son, you wouldn't want to do that, because that's your means of lineage that you're leaving there. And so I don't see a slight against the firstborn son here. I see if the family chooses to not follow God's law, then they're showing themselves to not be of God. And so therefore they are kicked out, if you will, of the people of God. Again, I don't know if that helps or hurts any matters. But again, I would just point to this. There's really no reason to not follow through with this practice. Later, that's written into this law is the allowance for if you don't have a lamb, right? That's exactly what Mary and Joseph did. They took 2 turtle doves because they couldn't afford a lamb. Now, some would theologize that and say they already had the lamb, but we're not going to go there. But so I mean, to not do this would just would be simple disobedience and defiance against God's law. And I don't know, like, I don't know, again, I don't know of a way in which that they wouldn't deserve that which would, because they're proving themselves to be not of God if they don't want to participate or memorialize the redemption that they are taking advantage of. Because ultimately, they were redeemed. And that's what this whole thing is kind of revolving around. It's supposed to be this way to speak and teach about their redemption from Israel, or excuse me, from Egypt. And so what they're being, quote unquote, redeemed from, right, is the certain death that they faced in Israel, or excuse me, I keep saying that, in Egypt. They would have been the recipients of death had they not killed the lamb. And so this is then showcasing that.
But they're not being redeemed from death if they're not going to die. They're not redeemed.
Well, by being cut off from the land which God has promised them, they are, in a sense, experiencing death, if you will. Well, just from being cut off of God's people. Because the whole thing, that's why in verse 11 he makes a huge deal about the fact, hey, you're now in Canaan. When you get to Canaan, in the land that I've given you, namely you are experiencing the blessings that I have brought you into by my redemption of you from Egypt, and now given this to you, this is what I require from you, to follow these feasts, these memorials, these types of things, these laws. And to not do that, they are cut off from those blessings. They lose their inheritance. They lose their access to God. They lose a great number of things by setting themselves in opposition to Him. And so, again, this concept of death, I mean, we have a big discussion about death, but as it relates to death, excommunication from the Garden of Eden, those types of motifs are carrying on here. That not doing what God has required is judged by death or separation from right relationship to God. And so I think that there's a lot that's kind of melding together there, but again, so I'll let that sit for a second. What do we think?
How much fear they would have coming out from everything they just come from. If they didn't want to obey, yeah, why don't we just stay in Egypt? I'm just curious. That is a question there. How many would have not done that?
Anything ever says really?
No.
I think they would have just stayed behind if they didn't want to obey God and go with.
Because it says in 31, and Israel saw the great works the Lord did among the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord.
I think it could go a long way as if we defined redemption more thoroughly.
Yeah.
If we, I don't know if you plan to do that, maybe, yeah, I think it would help, to defining redemption, what exactly redemption and redeeming is. Also, I've been really questioning whether or not to like add this in or ask what the implications of this would be. But we essentially have two covenants going on here at once, right? Like there's the Mosaic covenant, and the one which Paul says is not annulled because it came 430 years earlier is the Abrahamic covenant. Right? Like I would argue just because you're in the Mosaic covenant doesn't mean you're quote unquote saved as like we would think you're saved.
Right.
Right? Like I mean, I don't know if you can be saved and not be in the Mosaic covenant during those times. That'd be kind of a little bit weird and shaky. Like how can you be a transgressor of the law? It'd be weird. But it does seem that because salvation is still by faith in the Old Testament, right? Even in the Old Testament, that's how Abraham was saved. He was reckoned to him by faith.
Right.
And so just because he's I don't know what the implication of this be, but it just because he cuts off that family from the community of Israel, it doesn't mean he's effectively cut them off from salvation per se, or salvation as salvation. He's cut them off from the community of people which is composed of people who are saved and people who are not saved.
Right.
I don't know if that adds any implication or if that was just unnecessary to add on. I was thinking about. But the bigger thing I thought of was redemption and how we would actually define redemption.
Yeah, so defining redemption here and how it's being used, which is why last time we went to a couple of different places because there are different words that are being used here. So it's not always the prototypical word for redemption in the Old Testament that's used across these 6 cases that this law is talked about, the consecration of the firstborn. And so just go ahead and say that outright. Redemption here is I would argue that redemption here is the purchase back of that which would have been lost. And so here that's why it makes the image so powerful, in that without the lamb you would have lost your firstborn. And so thereby, to redeem your firstborn back, because it is mine, you are now offering up a lamb to have it returned to you.
I guess that's where my confusion is.
Okay.
The 10th plague happened. It was a one-time event where God sent the death angel to take firstborn. So they offered up the lamb for the first.
Right.
The redemption took place.
Yep.
So why is it compounded for the rest of Israel's time of existence?
Well, I mean, the same.
Not every firstborn of the Egyptians died every single time it was born. Why is the plague continuing in Israel and not in Egypt? And not in any other country?
Yeah, no, and so the same question could literally be asked of the Passover as well. Why practice the Passover if it happened one time?
Well, the Passover is just like a festival memory thing.
Well, I mean, they still had to kill a lamb for the purpose of memorializing that which they did to celebrate their redemption.
Okay, so there you go. My question's tenfold. Why are they sacrificing so much for a plague to happen?
Yeah, and so why do we do the Lord's Supper?
But we're not killing anything.
Well, we're not killing anything, but we're memorializing the fact that something was killed for us.
Right.
And so
But that's different from re-killing the lamb every time you remember that.
I guess this is what it was back then, and then God died for us, and now we don't have to do that anymore.
I mean, there is the question as to whether or not, and this gets at kind of the question of Jim last week, are these sacrifices really effective, or are they just something that is done, right, over and over and over and over again?
Right, because my understanding of sacrifice in the Old Testament is that you are appeasing God's wrath in some way.
Mm-hmm.
But these just seem to be for funds.
Well, I mean,
Why is God asking for sacrifice just for yay?
Offering.
Well, I would say that it's not necessarily offering sacrifice just for yay. There is a real reality which they are constantly being, again, the question of whether or not Old Testament sacrifices were effective in what they did, what they accomplished, is asked time and time again. The answer to that question, I think if we were to confine it to the Old Testament, the way that the Old Testament is written, I would argue that they believed that it was effective, right? So it's a whole nother question for New Testament authors and then further on to ask the question of whether or not it was doing anything then. But the way that the Old Testament is actually written is that it seems to be doing something. That this blood is in fact that which is covering or appeasing the wrath of God against sin in the nation of Israel. And so that's kind of what I always come back to when the question of effectiveness of sacrifice is asked. Because the Old Testament authors seem to be acting in a manner that, yes, us killing or sacrificing these animals is actually appeasing God's wrath, or covering it for a time. Depends on which way you want to understand the word that means redeem. And so however we look at this, I would argue that it's not just for fun. It's a way in which the Israelites participate in and remember that which was done for them. And so I don't think that that's just fun per se. I think that it's a very strong message of, yes, we deserve this, but we know we got that instead of what we deserved. And so as to what you said about the plague continuing in Israel and not in Egypt, because Egypt doesn't follow God. They're under God's wrath continuously in perpetuity because they defied God in all things. But those who do follow after Yahweh in the Old Testament, they have a stake, if you will, in the remembering of the great thing that God did for them. And if it was a lamb that was offered up to remember that which was done, and again, we think of sacrifice so often as this thing that, okay, they kill a lamb, boom, it's gone, it's done. Sometimes it was. Olah sacrifices completely burn up in the flames of offering. But a lot of times these were meals. These were things that the priests and the family partook of together in worship of the Lord. It's not, we get this picture of they just bring a huge lamb slab, throw it up on a fire, and then cool, I'm good, I'm done for my time, and I'm going to go on. But in large percentage, these feasts were participatory in nature. And so the family, it was a time in which, that's why you have the ability for the son to ask, well, what does this mean? It's because when they do it, it's not just we threw the lamb on the fire. It's hey, do you know what this represents, what this means for us as a people? We now get to experience the infinite blessings of God because of that which God has done for us in bringing us out. And we now follow this feast for the purpose of not only teaching, so it's not only pedagogy, so teaching your little ones, but it's also participatory worship in the same way that I would argue we do the Lord's Supper. Yes, we don't re-crucify Jesus every single time we do it, but we're celebrating the fact that he was. And there are some tinges of he died once for all, right? For there is no need for subsequent sacrifices because he was it. He's all that it took. But with these, there is an insufficiency nature in them in which they do have to continue to be done. And so I would And I know that I probably haven't answered any of the questions to a satisfactory amount, but I would point to the theological truths that they are representing, and also the great enjoyment that I believe that these festival and feasts and consecrations and stuff would have been. It's not just, again, I'm not piggybacking or picking apart your statement. It's not just for fun. It's for worship. It's for purposes of worshiping the Lord. And this is a means by which they do it, by sacrificing that which was required, and A, providing for the priests that continue to intercede for them, and B, take part in some parts of the animal themselves to allow and demonstrate to their children, this is our faith. This is what our family does. This is how we follow Christ, or excuse me, follow God. This is how we commit ourselves to Yahweh. And we experience the blessings of the land because of what God has done for us. And so we remember and celebrate and worship Him for that. And so these, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but these feasts were not just for this and then the killing of an animal. It also was a means by which they worshiped. It was a way that they participated in worship of God. And I think often we think of sacrifices in that way, that category, is that we think of them as kind of disjointed from the people that are doing them. But in reality, the only feasts that were disconnected in that way were the Olah sin offerings, the completely burnt up ones. Everything else was really for the purposes of corporate worship and participatory worship of God. And yes, they were meant to point to and specifically celebrate certain things in Israel's history, but they were for the purpose of pointing people further to God, to right worship of Him and right understanding of who He is. And so I would, again, I guess I would point more toward the theological truths that this is trying to implicate, because I think that's what the text tells us to do, in that when your son asks, that's the whole purpose of that section regarding the consecration of the firstborn. It's not the 3-month-old baby that's asking this question, you know what I mean? It's the other members of the family unit. It's the community at large that's being taught about what God has done for His people. So anyway, that help, hurt, indifferent.
So if I just maybe sum it up a little bit here.
Mm-hmm.
So firstborn son, why firstborn son? Sacrifice for this, why sacrifice for that? It seems like those are like firstborn son as opposed to a firstborn daughter. Is that sexist? Like sacrifice, why are they sacrificing this lamb for something that's already been done? And I think you explained it really, really, really well. But is there any leeway, or is there any validity to the idea that God is using cultural norms to establish something recognizable? I guess so the firstborn son, it seems like that is the creation of the culture, not necessarily God's creation of it, right? Like He wasn't like, oh, it'll be the firstborn son. Like, no, like that was a very prevalent thing in that context, the idea of the firstborn son carrying off the progeny and everything moving forward. And so God uses that as a way to communicate, I'm ending you right now to Egypt, and firstborn son of Israel, you're my people, to go on. Firstborn son, that's how you go on. So I'm going to use that for this sacrifice. Sacrifices are another thing that are widespread in the culture. It's not just Israel that's making sacrifices. Mm-hmm. And so that just seems like a readily available means by which God can relate His truth to what's going on as well. And I think there's some theological element with Christ as a sacrifice too, so that maybe it just goes beyond that. But at least part of it, like part of the issue seems like why we don't understand the idea of slaughtering lamb in our place or anything like that. But to them, that was a normal thing, right? Like, does that make sense? Is there any validity to that? Of like, would they even think about this? Like, why would we do this? Like, why was God asking us to do this? This makes no sense. Like, would they even think to ask that question? Would they be like, oh, that makes sense? let's do it. And of course, it's a worship event, a celebratory festival.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Yeah, so to your first point, there's a couple of things there. So to your first point about the firstborn son,
Yeah,
right? That's what made the 10th plague so detrimental,
yeah,
right? Is because of this cultural reality,
exactly, yeah.
which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
true in the
Yeah.
carrying of one's lineage
Yeah.
through multiple generations.
So it's not just a necessarily objective thing. Like if it had been something else, God would have used that then, right? Like
I think he very well could have, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's yeah. Okay.
And so, I mean, you know, I may get flack for this, but if it would have been firstborn daughter, right, in the culture,
Mhm.
if the daughters it would have been the means by which progeny and continuation of lineage were thought to have been carried out.
Mhm.
The 10th plague, I would venture a guess, and this is just assumption, it's kind of getting into the mind of God, which I don't know, but I would venture a guess that God would not have killed the firstborn when the firstborn male, when the firstborn female was valued much more.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, as you're pointing out, the use of things that are already present, norms that are there already, I think that there is some validity to that. We get into trouble when we carry that maybe a little bit too far
Sure.
at times, but I do think that there are cultural realities that God is speaking into, and that's why I always come back to the question to ask myself, how would I have had God do it differently?
Mhm.
And if how I would have had God do it differently has a tendency to equate with more of our modern sensibilities,
Mhm.
then I may have missed the point of the text.
Mhm.
And so again, like that's just a question I ask myself as to, because there's a lot of things in the scripture that I'm like, man, I don't necessarily like that very much.
Can I maybe like just adjust that? Like, how would this be recognizable to me? Or how would I have, instead of how would I have God do this differently, how would this be recognizable to me? If God wanted to communicate the same truths, how would how would he do it in such a way that I would understand?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's essentially, yeah, thank you. I think that's a helpful way to say it. And so anyway, I oftentimes ask myself when I do meet a very difficult text, like I just don't like that. Like that if it seems to offend my personal sensibilities that is true,
Mhm.
right? I have to then ask myself that question.
Mhm.
And then if the answer that I come to is more of a, I don't want to use modern versus pre-modern or anything like that, just
Sure.
a nowadays understanding of that text, I may have missed the point of what was being communicated there. And so, yeah, so there is this validity to using the cultural norms of what is normally going on in the cultures that are surrounding them. But there's also a sense that I don't want us to miss of countercultural realities that exist within the Old Testament text. There are some things that are just completely backwards to how the culture at large would have thought to do things, that God lays down as a norm, that you will do this. And we'll get to some of those when we get to the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 20 to 23. There is just no cultural reason why God would have instructed them to do that. And the only conclusion that we can draw is that God is establishing something new. It is related to what is true in the culture, but only insofar as it is the opposite of what the culture values. And he's like, no, you'll value this more because it has to do with me. So that would be the other thing that I would point out in what you said. So the cultural norms, yes, but there are certainly times in which God specifically goes against what was being done in the culture, which is why some people want to turn this passage into a child sacrificing passage. There are those scholars that say, well, God's instituting child sacrifice here. No, he's not. In fact, he's doing something completely opposite to what that is and what those cultures believed. He's intentionally speaking in opposition to that, in that in other cultures that did practice child sacrifice, there was no option for redemption. If you didn't do it, your family died. Like, I mean, it's just not, God is saying, no, I'm not requiring that. I'm giving you a means by which grace can be applied because I am a good, gracious God. And so I would say that this text written to Canaanite, Hivite culture would have read very differently. Again, this is making some assumptions of the culture, but given what we know about their cultural practices, this text would have been no, I'm your gods, plural. I require your firstborn, whatever. You will crucify him to me in this specific way. You will put him in an oven. You will do this, 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 and this. And so when we measure what God does against what the cultures around them at the same time we're doing, what we get out of that is often a more gracious, loving law that is being applied. And I don't want us to gloss over that either. So anyway, any further questions? I know that we've been a little bit long tonight, but I think this is helpful because again, I wanted to put the pause button on for just a second because again, we've gone through a tremendous amount. And some of the questions that have been raised are the exact questions that people ask of us about the text that we hold as sacred. And so for Ray, thank you for your question. Joanna, thank you so much for yours as well, because it's important that we wrestle with hard stuff. Because if we don't do it here, like what are we really doing? Are we really seeking to know what this thing means if we don't ask the hard questions of the text? And if I've done a poor job in any of them, I pray that you would give me grace in that, and we can talk further about it. Any further questions, thoughts? Okay. Awesome. Jim, would you mind closing some prayer?
Lord, thank you. We can gather here, and Father, we put it way too simply. We see through a glass darkly. We don't understand everything. We don't comprehend everything that's in your word, Father, but help us understand it. In our minds that we can grasp what you're saying, what you're communicating in really profound and deep ways. And so that we might not be just gathering information, Father, but that we may change us through you. Thank you for that and preparing us, Father. Help us to apply it to our lives. Help us to take what's being said here and have it change us, have it have something. There's something.
Thank you guys so much. It was great to see everybody. Pray that God's face will shine upon you. Remember, God loves you, and so do I.